So everybody, welcome. This time we're going to do it in English. Oh,
I hope so. Yeah.
In English, I'm really happy to present very briefly Jennie Brand. As you can see, she's from UCLA. She's a well-known sociologist who's worked on stratification, lots of things, family education. She had a really important suite of papers not so long ago on the heterogeneous effects of education on all kinds of aspects of life force, fertility, voluntary participation, income, all that good stuff, and so on. And in fact, that reflects a lot of her methodological skills, which is also a whole suite of papers and programs in heterogeneity of causal effects and so on. But you're here to hear Jennie, not me, so I'm going to turn it over to you now. But Jennie, I'm really happy you're here.
Thank you so much. Sure. Thanks so much for having me. It's really great to be here. Some of that work that Herb was mentioning will be reflected here today too. And this is a collaborative project with an excellent graduate student at UCLA, Rivaris Moore, who's on the job market. Shi Song, who is an assistant professor of sociology at the University of Chicago and a recent UCLA PhD, and Yu Xia, who's a professor at sociology at Princeton, who I think many of you know. And this project is part of a larger project that Yu Xia and I have been working on for a long time on, and this segment of it is funded by NIH on heterogeneous treatment effects in demographic research. And the basis of the project is that the recognition that an essential feature common to all demographic phenomena is variability across units of analysis. There's social and behavioral sciences, such as sociology, economics, epidemiology, demography. They're population sciences in the sense that they treat individual level variation as part of reality and subject to scientific inquiry rather than mere nuisance or measurement error. So individuals differ not only in pre-treatment characteristics, but also, so what we call pre-treatment characteristics, all those characteristics that come before someone experiences an event or an intervention, but also in how they respond to a common treatment. And that we've been calling this type of variability treatment effect heterogeneity. And there's always a practical need to overlook some heterogeneity within a population in the social sciences. So social scientists, for example, often examine variation of treatment effects based on individual attributes like gender or race, ignoring, of course, variation then within those categories. So for questions of causal inference, the heterogeneity that we attend to that's consequential for selection bias is the likelihood that individuals experiencing the treatment. So it's between the treatment of interest and the probability or that propensity of selection into the treatment. And treatment effect heterogeneity has important implications for social and behavioral research and for social policy. So if policymakers understand patterns of treatment effect heterogeneity so defined, they can more effectively assign different treatments to individuals to balance competing objectives, such as reducing costs or maximizing the average outcomes. The study of treatment effect heterogeneity can also yield important insights into how scarce social resources are distributed in an unequal society, and how events differentially impact populations with different expectations of their occurrence, which is what I'll focus on today. So we described several of these advantages in an article published in Sociological Methodology back in 2012, which also demonstrates a range of different approaches for looking at heterogeneous treatment effects. Similarly, we described some of this in a book chapter on heterogeneity and volume on causal inference that was edited by Steve Morgan. And then so within this larger project, we have 5 specific aims. So I'm just going to mention them briefly here that I've condensed. So we demonstrate heterogeneous treatment effects in demographic research. We developed new statistical methods for estimating heterogeneous treatment effects. That was some of those papers that I was just showing. We developed a set of tools to analyze heterogeneous treatment effects in demographic research, demonstrate compositional biases that arise using standard statistical methods in the presence of heterogeneity, and then demonstrate the usefulness of estimating such heterogeneous treatment effects with applications to the study of the impact of family-level shocks. So it's this final aim that I'm focusing on today in this project. And most of my work on disruptive life events have focused on job loss, which serves as a relatively exogenous shock, especially compared to parental divorce. So looking at parental divorce has been a new domain. And so the first part of that project, of that fifth specific aim, was looking at the effects of job loss among single mothers on children's social psychological well-being and educational attainment. And that was published a few years ago with my then student, Julie Simon Thomas. And so that brings me to the current study. So today, I'm looking at the impact of parental divorce on children's educational attainment. So first, just some background on the substance of the problem. So we know, of course, that family disruption has long been implicated as a critical family-level shock impacting the lives of children. A substantial literature suggests that parental divorce negatively impacts academic achievement in school, social psychological well-being, and educational attainment of young adults. A lot of the most highly cited research in public discourse has some assumption, or some implicit assumption at least, that parental divorce is uniformly negative for children. We know, though, that some studies have found variation in effects by family socioeconomic status, by race, by family environment. So by family SES and race, studies have suggested smaller effects for children of less educated parents and non-white children than for children with more educated parents and white children. So the negative effects potentially might be greater among higher SES and white children who are less accustomed to disruptive socioeconomic events and disadvantaged circumstances than children of lower socioeconomic backgrounds and racial and ethnic minority children. By family environment, children's response to parental divorce may also vary by the degree of family conflict. So divorce may offer some relief from the stress of a high conflict family environment. So some research suggests that children of married parents with high levels of conflict are no better off, and in fact may fare worse in many aspects than children of single parents. So what we suggest, is that a shared latent factor underlying those interactions between family socioeconomic status and well-being and parental divorce is the likelihood that disruption occurs. So some of the explanation I was giving for some of those patterns were dictated by this idea that they have in common the likelihood that the disruption occurs. So families differ in their expectation of an ability to adjust to disruption. So in this study, we consider how the effects of parental divorce on children's education differ across families with different likelihoods of disruption. And that's in some ways the substantive rationale, but there's another rationale that involves selection processes. So we know that selection bias is a key issue in the study of the causal effects of divorce with observational data. Prior research on divorce has adopted a range of different approaches to try and address this key issue of selection into parental divorce, so it's a major concern. Yet prior work hasn't considered how the effects of divorce relate to the selection into divorce. So we think that there's both this kind of underlying substantive rationale that gives a parsimonious way to summarize a lot of different interactions with individual attributes, and this kind of important selection story. So variation in the divorce effect by the estimated propensity to experience a parental divorce captures that effect heterogeneity that we're interested in. By focusing on variation by the propensity of divorce, we offer also alternative interpretations of the pattern of results based on both observed selectivity and unobserved selectivity that may dictate some of the patterns. So what are some hypotheses? So we expect that divorce has minimal effect on the attainment of children who have a higher likelihood of experiencing such an event. So as I was summarizing with these other attributes of divorce among families marked by disadvantage who've potentially grown accustomed to lots of disruptive types of events in their lives may not elicit the same negative consequences for that single event of the parental divorce. The presence of a peer network with a higher incidence of disruption may likewise diminish distress and social stigma associated with parents divorcing. And then we hypothesize that the effects of parental divorce will be greatest for children who have a low likelihood of experiencing the event. So families expecting marital stability, unprepared for disruption, likely experience considerable adjustment difficulties in the face of parental divorce, leading to these negative effects on children. And parental divorce may elicit an acute sense of deprivation among children whose peers tend to be likewise advantaged and for whom family instability is uncommon. We may also observe larger effects for families with a lower likelihood of parental divorce if there's greater unobserved selectivity within that population. So we've now, thus far I'm considering who divorce impacts and how that response varies, but we in this project also attend to how divorce exerts its impact. So attention to mediation is central to our understanding of how the effects of parental divorce emerge through various intermediate pathways. And for a mechanism to mediate parental divorce effects on children's education, it must satisfy two conditions. So the mechanism must be influenced by parental divorce, and then the mechanism must also influence children's educational outcomes. So this is just a directed acyclic graph which demonstrates those two conditions that must be satisfied for the mediator to play that role. And then in addition to heterogeneity in the total effects, so the story we're talking about total effects, we're also going to pay attention to heterogeneity in those mediating effects. So how does this mediating process play out across families with different likelihoods of divorce occurring? So they're the two conditions. So what about some hypotheses about heterogeneous mediating effects? So what are some of the key mechanisms? We're first going to consider family conditions, and so one mechanism is the increase in family instability or family transitions that occur subsequent to divorce, remarriage, further divorce, cohabitation, union dissolution. Sarah McClanahan's recent work has been, for example, really emphasizes this as a key explanatory factor. And in terms of the two conditions that must be satisfied, we know that divorce is associated with an increase in family instability. There can still be family instability among married couple parents. People separate or move in and out, but of course we expect more of this subsequent to divorce. And then we also know that family instability lowers children's educational attainment, leads to high levels of parenting stress, lower quality parent-child relationships, and so forth. In terms of the heterogeneity we might expect, so families with a low likelihood of initial disruption presumably may experience less further disruption subsequent to the divorce. So it took a lot for the divorce to occur in the first place, so potentially that doesn't play as big a explanatory role as it might for those more prone to subsequent disruption. So that's our prior, at least on family disruption. Second, so the second family condition we consider is family income, with, of course, expectedly plays a central role in the association between divorce and children's education. It satisfies both conditions, so divorce is associated with a decline in family economic resources, with the loss of a parent in the household, typically the father. It's quite a big drop. And family income we know from lots and lots of work that family income plays a significant role in children's educational attainment. In terms of heterogeneity, here we think family income will probably play a pretty major role in all the groups that we look at. Potentially, while more advantaged families have higher levels of economic resources than disadvantaged families, the resource loss as a result of divorce is maybe more pronounced. For the most disadvantaged families, perhaps income may have already been below the threshold of investment in higher education, so the further drop in resources, potentially, at least if we think of it as that direct role as paying for college or going to college, might be not as big a factor. So we know from a lot of research that these two conditions are clearly should be explanatory mechanisms. We know less about their relative weight and the association between divorce and children's education across these families with varying likelihoods of disruption. Two potentially other important mechanisms include children's skills. So we're going to consider children's cognitive skills and their psychosocial skills. So first, for cognitive skills, and here I'm going to start with condition 2. So cognitive ability has played a central role in models of status attainment, human capital models. We know cognitive ability has a strong impact, very strong impact on educational attainment. So that's okay. For condition 1, the between-person variation in cognitive skills, we know from developmental psychology, work in developmental psychology, that it becomes relatively stable by early childhood. So we shouldn't expect family disruptive events to play a major role in cognitive development, at least beyond those early childhood years. So while we want to test that and look at this with cognitive skills, but our hypothesis is that cognitive skills really shouldn't play an explanatory role in the effect of divorce on education. We were keenly interested in children's psychosocial skills and the role that they play. So this was actually the basis of the beginning of this project, was just to think about the effect on children's psychosocial skills and how it explains educational attainment, and then we kind of built up from there. So this is also called, non-cognitive skills, socio-emotional skills, personality traits, cultural capital, lots of different names. They encompass a broad class of attitudes and behaviors that are correlated with but distinct from cognitive traits: emotional stability, self-esteem, mastery, locus of control, conscientiousness, aspirations. A number of different measures kind of fall under this domain. So, and so a lot of some research has treated children's psychosocial and cognitive skills as parallel or symmetrical outcomes of family disruption. So we're instead maintaining that the development literature points to important asymmetry between these types of skills in their role as serving as mechanisms. And so the two conditions are satisfied. Cognitive psychosocial skills evolve and change throughout childhood, allowing family disruptive events potentially to play a role in their development. And a growing body of research has, notably by Jim Heckman and others, has pointed to the important role of psychosocial skills in impacting children's educational attainment. So we want to understand the degree to which these skills account for the association between divorce and education, and how that compares to the family conditions, the explanatory role that each of these plays, and how that mediation process differs across families. And then in terms of heterogeneity here, so we expect that the marginal effect of psychosocial decline may differ across families, particularly if the children unaccustomed and unprepared for disruption experience a greater psychological shock to parental divorce, then potentially that plays a more explanatory role in the association between divorce and education. So to summarize, the study is motivated by two central aims: to assess how the effects vary across families with varying likelihoods of disruption. So the idea is that through examining this type of heterogeneity, and by the observed propensity that children experience parental divorce, we can shed new light on subpopulations for whom divorce, the causal effects of divorce may be considerable, modest, or even absent. And then once we determine how total effects vary across families, that we assess the mechanisms or indirect effects through which those effects occur. Throughout the analyses, we carefully attend to the assumptions and methods needed to estimate both total and mediating causal effects. So mechanisms explaining the effects of divorce have long been conjectured, investigated, debated, yet few studies have paid very careful attention whether and for whom these mediation effects are causal. So the data is from the NLSY, the nationally representative sample of over 12,000 respondents who were 14 to 22 when they were first surveyed in 1979, interviewed annually through 1994 and biennially after. In 1986, the National Longitudinal Survey began a separate survey of the children of the NLSY women, the NLSCM, and data have been collected every 2 years since 1986. So as of 2012, the roughly 6,000 NLSY women who were about 47 to 54 years old at that time had given birth to about 11,500 children. So we restrict to children who are born into marriage and to children who are at least 18 years old by 2012 to examine, at least have a look at high school completion. And then we identify children who experience parental divorce throughout childhood from birth to age 17. And we evaluate the effects of divorce on children's education. We adopt the potential outcome approach, ask whether a child whose parents had divorced have outcomes differ than he or she otherwise would have had if its parents had not divorced. Of course, the key to this, the strategy is the ignorability assumption that parental divorce is an event that is uncorrelated with unobserved factors that affect children's outcomes, which is a pretty strong assumption in the case of a very self-selective kind of process. But we condition on the analysis on an extensive set of observed covariates. So we look at family background factors of mothers, race, national origin, residential location, religion, family structure and size, household income of mothers during childhood, socioeconomic factors of mothers and households, education, employment status, job conditions, delinquency, household income, poverty, welfare status, a range of cognitive and psychosocial factors here again of the mothers, so psychosocial skills pretty much parallel the ones we look at for children, delinquency, depressive symptoms, BMI, cognitive ability, high school academic achievement, and then a range of family formation and well-being factors, so early sexual activity, beliefs about traditional family roles, age at the time of child's birth, prior marriages, time between marriage and first birth, desirability of birth of a child, child gender, child birth weight. It's a long list. Whether parents argue about chores, money, cheating, religion, whether they match with respect to religion, education, and race. And so my graduate student, Ravar, spent a lot of years developing this model and going through all these data, but and recently we've tried some machine learning approaches and other things to kind of boost the model, but there's still no reason that we should assume that the ignorability assumption holds true here. Families self-select into divorce due to lots of factors that we may not be able to capture. So the mediators, as said, relationship transition is a count of the times the transition occurs between the states of married, separated, remarried, widowed, cohabitating, total family income, and that's all subsequent to divorce. Children's cognitive skills is constructed by averaging 3 Peabody individual achievement test scores, reading comprehension, reading recognition, and math. Psychosocial skills is a scale that was constructed with 5 indicators: Perlin mastery, the scale, Rosenberg self-esteem scale, a 10-item the 10-item personality inventory emotional stability component, and behavioral problems index, and CSD, the depressive symptoms. We examined each of those items individually, actually each of the items within each of those scales, and then each of the scales, and ultimately decided that we can construct this summary scale with little loss of information and to parse down how much we were looking at here. So a few additional comments on the mediator construction. So all the mediators were constructed as averages of the years over the years subsequent to the parental divorce. So of course, children whose parents divorce, they have an observable event time that occurs, which allows us to average this after the event occurs. For those children whose parents didn't divorce, we match them to the children whose parents divorced, and then simulated a divorce event time, and then use that as the basis by which we think of it as subsequent to that event occurring. And then the outcomes, so high school completion by age 18, college attendance by age 19, college completion by age 23. So these are really timely, on time, so to speak, indicators of educational attainment. And then so estimating total effects, so the analytical approach necessitates as a first step this construction of the propensity score. And so we examine the set of factors and how they influence selection into parental divorce. Surprisingly, in my read of a lot of the literature on parental divorce, there's not a lot of these models actually presented that show the covariates and how they impact parental divorce, to get a sense of how well you're doing in terms of adjusting for these factors. Then we estimate average treatment effects conditional on the estimated propensity for parental divorce, linear probability models of the effects of divorce on these three measures of children's education. So those are the total effects. The heterogeneous effects, so we assess whether the effects of divorce vary with the propensity for parental divorce. So we're going to adopt two approaches for estimating those under this ignorability assumption. So the first is what we're calling this matching smoothing non-parametric method, and it consists of the following steps. So we estimate the propensity for parental divorce for all the units, then we match the treated, the children of divorced parents, to the untreated with a matching algorithm. We plot those observed differences in the pair between a treated unit and an untreated unit against a continuous representation of the propensity score. You'll kind of see how this looks once you see the results. And then use a non-parametric method, local polynomial smoothing, to smooth the variation and match differences to obtain the pattern of treatment effect heterogeneity along the propensity score. So we'll kind of see the variation and effects across that propensity. Then if there appears to be effect heterogeneity that maybe could be summarized more succinctly, we then switch to a parametric approach which assesses effects separately by strata of the estimated propensity score. So this is really just like a basic, looking at group differences but we're just categorizing them by their estimated propensity scores. So then you can perform these approaches too if you like, because we developed this data module called HTE, Heterogeneous Treatment Effect. So this is my advertisement for the methods. And just go into SATA and SSC, install HTE, and you got it. And you could do too. So in this study, so we're also acknowledging the presence of unobserved factors that affect the likelihood of divorce. So some unobserved factors may reflect parents' willingness or their resistance to divorce. So we're going to we have P equals the summary index of the observed propensity, and then U is indicating some unobserved resistance to divorce. And we're going to let the latent divorce function equal D star is P minus U, so parents divorce when D star is greater than 0. And then we define the effect of parental divorce on children's outcomes to be a function of both P and U, at least for interpretive purposes. We can think about it this way, conceptualize it this way. And then the question becomes, when we do observe treatment effect heterogeneity, how do we interpret it? And so here's a set of depictions to start us thinking about how we interpret effects by these different factors. So the ignorability assumption here, in this case, both panels A and B are our interpretation under an ignorability assumption. If we assume that we've accounted for all the factors that influence selection into divorce, U is ignorable. So we have this axis of U, but we see that the effects are not really driven by U. They're driven by P, right? And so then if we observe larger effects, so here we're saying darker colors indicate larger effects. So if we observe larger effects for those with a low propensity, we're interpreting them as being a greater substantive effect for those with a low propensity of experiencing parental divorce. In figures C and D here, we consider the more general case of that marginal treatment effect to be a function of both P and U. So lower observed propensity for divorce is associated with lower unobserved resistance to divorce. So substantively, we might take the lower resistance to indicate that parents choose divorce despite potential negative effects for children's well-being. So this then could give rise to these larger negative effects that we observe among those lower propensity children. So you note the high correlation between P and U among treated units in figure D here. So at low values of P, the estimated effect includes proportionally more children who have low values of resistance U, and at higher values of P, the estimated effect includes more variation with respect to U, so proportionally more children whose parents have higher values of U. So in our analysis, we're presenting simple results based on the observed likelihood, and they're informative descriptive results in their own right. And if ignorability is true, we can interpret those patterns and the effect of divorce as a function of the likelihood of divorce. If ignorability doesn't hold, we can still have some assessment. So such that we have heterogeneous responses to latent dimensions of divorce. They're in some ways still interpretable in the sense that they indicate variation in effects of divorce by this latent dimension of unobserved parental, let's say, parental resistance to divorce. Am I still doing methods? Okay, this is now the heterogeneous mediation effects. So the mediation models, the mediation methods using a potential outcome approach have expanded dramatically in recent years. It's an exciting new area. Well, it's an old area, but it's getting more interest in recent years. And so the idea is that a causal mediation analysis is designed to estimate the role of mechanisms in transmitting the effect of a treatment on an outcome, and to take a potential outcome approach to thinking about mediation effects like it did for total effects. It offers this conceptual apparatus and tool by which you can really think about the assumptions you need to hold to estimate a mediation effect and assign it some causal value. So to identify mediating effects, we have to assume what's called now sequential ignorability. So give an adjustment for all the X variables, for the pretreatment covariates, the treatment is assumed to be independent of potential outcomes and of potential mediators. And each mediator is assumed to be independent of potential outcomes. So this is just the expanded directed acyclic graph that illustrates this relationship between P, D, M, and Y. And so let's just lay this out a little more. So we let M denote the potential value of the mediator that would be realized under treatment status D. Only the potential mediator that corresponds to the actual treatment is observed. So we let y dm represent the potential outcome that would result if the treatment and mediating variables equal d and m, respectively. So then we can identify the total effect. So here's the total effect, which is actually, it really is the same equation that was up previously for the total effect, but now with just how the mediator, the role of the mediator being explicitly notated here. And then with it, we define the causal mediation effect of the treatment on the outcome through the mediating variable here. And so this shows what change would occur to the outcome if the mediator changed from what was observed when units are treated to what would be observed when units are untreated, holding the treatment status at D. And so this deactivates all pathways except for the operating through that focal mediator. The mediation effect, for example, should explain something like the degree to which parental divorce impacts college attendance by decreasing children's psychosocial skills. And that's the type of question we want to answer. And then we also have, we're going to do this all within these specific heterogeneous strata of the propensity score. And then we get this nice summary, which is actually the thing I'll report, the proportion mediated, which is just the proportion of the causal mediation effect to the total effect. So the mediation analysis answers what proportion of the total effect is indirect. And finally, we estimate some sensitivity analyses of heterogeneous total effects and mediating effects. So this provides some general framework for assessing the extent to which these effects are sensitive to unobserved covariates, like the unobserved resistance that I talked about. So quantifying how the results would change if we relaxed that ignorability assumption. And so these can be assessed by subtracting a bias factor from the point estimates and the limits of the confidence interval of the estimated treatment effect. So that's equal to the product of two parameters. Gamma is the mean difference in children's outcomes associated with a unit change in an unobserved binary confounder. So this is like the U to Y path. And then lambda is the proportionate difference in the unobserved confounder between the children of divorced and non-divorced parents, so U to D. And the sensitivity of the mediation effects takes a similar, looks similarly where we add M to these terms. So results. So we first model the probability that a child experiences parental divorce over the course of childhood as a function of the covariates that we described. So here's just a summary of things that we found. I'm not going to present the huge model of the effects of all these factors on parental divorce. So generally let me just lay these all out. So the non-immigrant, absent fathers, low family size, that's for mother's family background factors, increase the odds of divorce, socioeconomic factors, low education of mothers, maternal employment, job inflexibility for mothers, delinquent activity, low household income, receipt of welfare, cognitive and psychosocial factors. So here, mastery, increase the odds of divorce, depressive symptoms, low BMI, maternal high school, and in this case, one of these somewhat flips of potentially what you might expect, maternal high school achievement and cognitive ability increased. The odds, family factors are early sexual debut, non-traditional family values, prior marriages, undesired child. This was measured just by how many children the woman initially said she wanted and what number child this was. Low childbirth weight, parents who argue about chores, those who do not argue about money. Arguing about money is a good thing. Who differ by education, differ by race, who do not differ by religion, which we thought must be, these are selective people who will get married despite religious differences and then are less likely to divorce. And then the total effects. So this is the first unadjusted look at just the total effects on high school completion and college attendance and college completion. So we observe that divorce is associated with an 8% lower level of high school completion, 12% for college attendance, and 11% for college completion. So these are just now, we predict that among children whose parents stay married, 82% complete high school, 57 attend college, 24 complete college. Among those that divorce, we have 75 and 45 and 13. And then,
is that the condition on high school completions, or is that just whole? When you look at the college attendance, it's not like a condition on high
it's it's all. So this is the whole sample. And it's almost the whole sample, except then each of those has a different sample just due to the age restriction that they have to be at least. Yeah. Okay, and then these are adjusted for the propensity for parental divorce, so the coefficients are somewhat smaller in magnitude than the unadjusted, but still more than, at least more than half the size. And so again, here a 4% difference, 7% difference between college attendance and college completion. So now we move to the heterogeneous effects. So that was just to get a look at the overall picture. And the first thing we're going to do is present these matching smoothing heterogeneous effects of divorce. So this is first for high school completion. So the x-axis represents the continuous propensity score. The y-axis are these treatment effects, the observed difference in high school completion between children whose parents did and did not divorce. So families in which divorce is more likely, generally, so along this x-axis generally have more disadvantaged conditions, socioeconomic conditions, family characteristics, family well-being. And so here we observe this curvilinear pattern where we have a negative effect of divorce on high school completion among children with a low to moderate propensity for divorce. And that's relatively flat here, and then has this big uptick at the end that reaches 0 and looks like has a positive tail here, but these are fewer cases at the tail of the propensity score distribution. For college attendance, the pattern's relatively more linear, indicating a general trend in a reduction of the negative effect of parental divorce on children's education as the propensity for divorce increases, again nearing 0 at the high propensity values. And for college completion, the pattern is also linear but steeper, indicating that sizable negative effect at the low to moderate level of parental divorce, near 0 and reaches above 0 as the propensity increases. So given these findings, we turn to the parametric effect estimates by propensity score strata. So given the kind of shape of even the way I was characterizing it, we chose to go with 3 propensity strata, the low, the moderate, the high. And it preserves cases, particularly at these tails of the distribution where the bias is most likely to occur. So unexpectedly, I think we find these, given at least what we saw in the matching smoothing, we find negative effects for the low propensity stratum, and just barely reaching significance for the moderate, and no significant effect. It has a negative value, but no significant difference for those with the highest likelihood. For college attendance, again, so the effect is largest among those with a low propensity for parental divorce, also significant for the moderate, and no significant effect for stratum 3.
Jen?
Yeah.
Before you go on, so What's the support at the extremes? I mean, are there a lot of people who are sort of behaving counterintuitively?
Yeah. I mean,
It's big enough that-
it's definitely big enough when we do 3 like this. If we wanted to parse it out more, then of course we start to lose power pretty quickly.
But there are people with high propensities for divorce who aren't getting divorced.
Oh yeah. And there's people with low propensities to divorce. Yeah, which is the nice thing that fuels this this type of research. But yeah, here it's three categories. In the work I've done in college, I often had 5, and sometimes these categories get, they could be 9 or 10 in the original specification, where there's really no significant differences between the 2 groups. Here we further adjust for the propensity score in each, because this stratification strategy doesn't fully eliminate the differences between the treated and untreated. And so finally, for college completion, same kind of pattern, where sizable here negative effect of parental divorce for the low propensity children, and on college completion, marginally significant here for the moderate, and no significant effect for the highest. So the next thing we consider is how the mediating effects of family conditions and children's skills. So each mediator is assessed in turn, and so the first thing here was family instability. So here, family instability only plays a role for children with a moderate propensity for divorce, and we didn't think that was kind of our prior, that we didn't think that it would play a big role for those with the low propensity. For the high propensity, you're not going to see anything reported, since there's no significant total effects, so the proportion mediating doesn't make sense here. Family income, in this way, in some ways, it's off the charts, which has some interesting explanations. And then family income plays a large role for those with a low propensity for divorce. And then finally, in children's cognitive skills, we have nothing. So no significant mediating effect that we found, which nicely supported that expectation. And children's psychosocial skills played a smaller role than we might have anticipated, but played the role we thought it would among this population of those who didn't potentially have this unexpected shock occur. And this is for college attendance. So again, family instability plays a role for college attendance for those with the moderate propensity. Family income dominates the story in every case, and cognitive skills have no significant mediating effect, and psychosocial skills play a role for those with the lowest propensity for divorce. And college completion here, family instability, and perhaps surprisingly, played some role in explaining the mediating effect, for explaining the total effect for the lowest propensity. Family income, nothing for cognitive skills, and psychosocial skills play some role. And of course, the measurement of college completion is further away from the measurement of the mediators with the college completion. So here I'm just going to summarize the sensitivity analysis results so that I don't show you any more of these results. So we invoke this sequential ignorability assumption. So for the total effects, we assume that the unobserved confounder, let's say it's something like father's full-time employment status, which we didn't observe in our work, and has recently gotten some attention as being an important predictor. Let's say it differs between divorced and non-divorced parents by about 5%. So very few of the observed characteristics that we look at differed much more than that between parents. To invalidate the results on high school completion, we need to further assume that children whose fathers are full-time employed have a 40% advantage in graduating from high school, which would not be the case. So we think and likewise, the effect remains significant even at 40% for college attendance and college completion. So in other words, the total effects seem pretty robust to unobserved confounding. The mediation effects, the family income mediation effects were quite robust. The psychosocial skills and family instability were more sensitive. Still, we're talking about maybe 10% differences, so it would have to be a crucial factor that explained the effect, but those are a little more suspect, let's say, to confounding. So what we find, just to summarize, so with careful attention to the assumptions needed to estimate total and mediation effects, we assessed whether the impact of divorce and the mechanisms that account for it vary across families with varying likelihoods. We think the results are noteworthy and comprehensible. So the negative effect of parental divorce on children's education varies inversely with the likelihood of divorce. We find significant negative effects on those with a low to moderate divorce and no effect among those with a high likelihood of parental divorce. The sensitivity analysis indicate that the total effects are highly robust to confounding. The divorce effects are overwhelmingly due to declines in family income. Psychosocial skills explain a portion of the effect for those with the low propensity, and cognitive family relationship transitions explain a portion for those with moderate propensity. Cognitive skills play no role in the negative effect of divorce on children's education. Even we thought maybe they would play a role in terms of measurement error, that you're picking up some of the psychosocial components, but we didn't even find that. So of course, we have the sequential ignorability assumption for the mediation effects. Those seem to hold up in terms of family income quite well. The others are at least a little more subject to confounding. So the interpretation of the effects. So divorce is a highly selective process. We can't plausibly account for all the factors that cause parents to end their marriages, particularly among those children who are unlikely to divorce. So again, one of the reasons we focus on these strata by the propensity score is because it gives us some clues about, or some way to interpret the results according to these selectivity factors. So that's been one key primary motivation of this approach that we've adopted in a number of these studies, is the interpretation of the effects and how they might be governed by both unobserved selection and observed selection. So what we said before, so if ignorability is accepted, the results suggest larger effects among children whose parents have a lower observed likelihood of divorce. If we think that's still suspect, even given some of these sensitivity tests, and then they could also reflect that there are larger effects among children whose parents have a lower observed likelihood and a lower resistance to divorce. So in quick conclusion, so it's implausible to assume that children respond identically to family disruption. The impact depends upon the context in which it occurs. So families prone to disruption have high levels of family and socioeconomic hardship, a social context in which family shocks and economic distress are more normative experiences. So when divorce is but one of many disadvantaged conditions, the effects of any particular adverse event are potentially rendered less severe. So educational attainment rates among children whose parents have a high probability of divorce are relatively low, and those rates are low whether parents divorce or not. For other families, disruption comes as a relative shock. Yeah. And so potentially instigating an acute sense of deprivation among children whose parents were unlikely, who otherwise lead more privileged lives, have a ultimately more profound impact upon their educational trajectories. Overwhelmingly, this seems to be the result of declines in family income, with psychosocial skills playing some role as well. So while this is my, I guess, caution. So while the effect of divorce is seemingly greatest among children of more advantaged families, not to say that we should shift attention away from children of disadvantaged families. So it's particularly telling and saddening that educational attainment rates among high propensity children is unaffected by such a big, potentially what you would think is a big change in their family life, suggesting in some ways that social discourse and policy aimed at promoting marital stability among disadvantaged families, at least without attending to the socioeconomic and family conditions in which such adverse events are expected, is misguided. And I'll end there.
Go ahead, I have a little technical question. Is the ignorability assumption something related to orthogonality of the forecasting errors on the two stages? Is it something like that?
Is it related, sorry, to?
To orthogonality of the forecasting errors of the two stages, or no?
No, I mean, so the ignorability assumption is just the assumption we make that we've accounted for all the factors that influence selection into treatment. So it's really just untestable assumption, you're right.
So what are the age range of children at the time of divorce?
So we actually looked at just the full range in childhood, so 0 to 17, and they can experience a divorce at any of those ages. We looked at the difference in the age occurring across the propensity strata, and it was about the same average. That was one thing we thought, maybe there's different ages in which, you know, the divorce occurs.
Are there enough data to look at?
I know, we wanted to. So it.
Something like the cognitive skills.
Yeah, right. Yeah, we wanted to do that, and maybe ultimately we will do that. If you looked at divorce that occurs in early childhood, and potentially that could have an impact on cognitive skills, then that would be something to do. And at one point we had parsed it out into early childhood, middle childhood, adolescence, and then by the time we're doing the strata and the mediation and everything else, it was getting a little, it's already a little big for one paper at least, and so we moved on from that. But in my prior work on job displacement among single mothers, we did this where we looked at the effects on these at least 3 different categories of childhood and found the biggest impact among single mothers losing their jobs was those when it occurred in adolescence. And not much in early childhood. I don't know how the patterns would play out here, but.
What is heterogeneous here is the propensities, are the propensities. So have you tried to make this heterogeneity assumption over time, like in a difference in difference? Yeah,
no, so at least for the total effects, we're looking at educational attainment. So there's no pre-treatment measure of educational attainment. We thought of doing some change scores with some of these mediators, but they also have some measurements that occur kind of later in childhood, and it further restricted our ability of what data we could use.
But I think propensity seems to me is like a black box. I mean, it is a combination of all factors, and we quite get it whether this divorce effect actually depends on family income, depends on the age of children. So I think one way of doing is obviously looking at this propensity, but always it seems to me that what really means is so complicated. So in other words, does the effect of divorce actually vary because children's age? I mean, like we can think about a simply interaction with the divorce effect with the age of children or maybe family income. Again, I think I don't want to pin out this one factor, but it gives a little different, the policy implication.
Yeah, I mean, it's a different, it's not race, and it's not gender, and it's a scale, and it's a latent construct of the likelihood that an event occurs. So it has a different interpretation. I don't know that it has a less useful interpretation. And terms of age, I don't think it is. Like I said, the average effect seems, or the average age of the timing of divorce seems to be about the same across these strata. But I mean, we've tried to push for these propensity score interactions as being a useful way of thinking about the likelihood of these things occurring. So like I said, they're rendered useful, I think, when I've looked at higher education, because we think of people on the margin of attending college, and that's a particularly policy relevant comparison. When we've also thought about just the, like I said, the distribution of scarce resources. So are people who are most likely to receive some kind of treatment, whatever it might be, those really the ones most likely to benefit from it. In this case, it's more of just thinking about the expectation of disruption, and that as being a shared factor across a lot of these individual attributes. And it's, you know, it's a parsimonious way to summarize a lot of different things that are occurring.
So the people that have like high propensity of divorce, also the people that have like low income, I guess, right? So those people are people that maybe they wouldn't go to college either if they divorce or not. I mean, divorce has no. So it's kind of like not surprising the result. I mean, because one nice thing that you were trying to say, I guess, it was like, okay, propensity score. So maybe if it's low, then it's an unexpected shock. If it's high, it's a kind of expected, if you want.
Yeah.
But it may be just a story of like income and or.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is in a lot of ways, and that's kind of our point, that, you know, that if you just say that there's a negative effect of divorce for the whole population, it's, once we parse it out this way, we don't see that. So it's not divorce. It's probably income and lots of other factors that govern why these kids don't go to college. I mean, we didn't even see an effect on high school completion for that population, but you know, but I think exactly, you know, that's what we're thinking is the main story. Yeah.
Jenny, thanks so much.
Thank you.